Richard McCall, your host here in Bogota, Colombia. Our very special guest this week is up in Ohio, Andrew Thomas, PhD, Professor of International Business at the College of Business, University of Akron in Ohio, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Transportation Security, and author of The Canal of Panama and Globalization, Growth and Challenges in the 21st Century. So welcome on the Latin News Podcast.
Hey, Richard, great. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure indeed to have you here because you are a total expert when it comes to business in Panama and, of course, the business of the Panama Canal, which has been making the news recently. So that's what we're going to discuss.
Sure. I'm happy to do this.
Okay, excellent. So we've obviously been seeing all of the issues of climate change, the lack of rainfall and fresh water in Panama, which of course is absolutely pivotal to the Panama Canal and its ease of running and everything else. Well, I mean, what do we see going forward? Are the rains picking up? Is there fresh water in Panama once again?
Well, we are right in the midst of the, as we're doing this in October, we're in the midst of the rainy season. The next couple of months, really up until maybe the week before Christmas, will be the heaviest rain. So there's hope that the nature will be kind and work in our favor. It's been a tough year. We've had these before. Probably most recently, 2019 was a year when it just didn't rain a whole lot. Fortunately, as the year went on and we got deeper into the rainy season, it kind of made up for it. So again, I think probably the hope for everybody would be that nature would shine, and not maybe shine per se, but certainly inundate Panama with the rain that it needs. You know, the issue, of course, is it's not just rainfall, and I think this is probably a blessing in one sense. It's called to attention, and not that the ACP, which runs the canal, hasn't known this for over 20 years. It speaks again to, I think, the broader issue of water management in Panama, and that's kind of the story that a lot of people don't seem to be paying as much attention to because it's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more national. It's not a global issue yet, except for the lack of rain, the issue probably wouldn't be getting national attention. So I believe it's something that we should, as folks that are looking at the canal and its impact and supply chains and globalization, is something that should be discussed as well.
So when we look at these this domestic water management, this is a demand for water. The canal itself is competing with population growth, agriculture, copper mines. Is that right?
Yeah, and you could even add light manufacturing as well, and it's also the fact, yes, as you mentioned, population growth. And I'm also a Panamanian as well as an American, so I don't want to speak ill of anybody. It's also just the fact that the water is not really well managed. Of course, to make the canal work, we need fresh water, and to make life go, we need fresh water. And the water management in Panama has been lacking. And again, this has been on the ACP's radar even before they gained complete control of the canal in 2000, that this was going to be an issue, just simply because for cultural reasons, for maintenance issues, lots of other stuff that's not sexy and glamorous. Water doesn't get, even though they get, our home, for example, in Panama City, we get 12 to 14 feet of rain a year. And on the Pacific side, I'm on the Pacific. On the Atlantic side, it's even more. They don't treat water probably the way they should. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
But this is very strange to me that that the primary business, I would say, obviously Panama, the canal, what it's known for.
Sure.
They have not incorporated water management. Why the ACP or the Panama Canal Authority? Why haven't they been working on this?
Well, it kind of speaks to the nature of the way the ACP operates in Panama. The ACP is it's a separate entity. There is a connection to the government in a couple of ways. The board of directors is named by the president, and of course, the customer of the Panama Canal ultimately is the nation of Panama, the people of Panama. So they're working on behalf of the people. Yet it's not a government operation; it's an independent operation. So what happens within the canal zone, they're solid on. The issue, though, is as we started the conversation, we're talking about what's going on around the canal. And of course, the canal is surrounded by a burgeoning population. It's surrounded by a growing economy that demands more water. It's also industry. It's mining. These kinds of things that are draining resources away. And so that combined with this water management issue at the national level, and now, and the last factor, of course, is lack of rain, is contributing to some real challenges for the ACP to do its job. So you can't point fingers and say who's to blame per se. It's a very complicated scheme that in one sense has served the canal exceptionally well. The fact that it can operate at a profit, unlike when the Americans ran it, we lost money every year. The Panamanians have made billions on it over the last 23 years, and will continue to make billions on it. The way that was set up to separate it from the government, though, it does put these challenges and pressures regarding water front and center.
I mean, it requires then the government to work on its side of things. So the infrastructure, as you say, on the Caribbean, I guess it's the port of Colon, and then on the Pacific coast, there needs to be a greater investment in those ends.
Yeah, and then as you get further away from the canal, just again, I mentioned in the book, and it's not, again, not to be critical, it's an observation. Drive around Panama City. We're 1.5 million people out of 4.5 million live, and go by a government building on any given day, drive by business buildings, people's homes, and there's leaks. Those leaks, and if you continue those drives day after day, week after, they continue. Again, Panama is blessed, and it has incredible natural bounty, including this liquid asset of massive rainfall and fresh water. I think there's a issue with culture in terms of how people perceive it. They use water almost incessantly. The cost of water is almost free. And it's about $10 a month that I pay in Panama City. So it is exponentially in people's minds something that it's free. It's unlimited. You manage that okay until you get a year that it doesn't rain a lot, and all of a sudden there's these moments of upheaval.
And this upheaval, I mean, we can bring them in together. We put protracted drought, the repercussions for Panama, obviously the issue of this infrastructure surrounding the canal. And if we wind back a couple of years and put in, the COVID-19 pandemic, we're looking at serious affectations to the supply chain security globally. I mean, let's go back to the pandemic, and how did that affect then the canal and trade?
Well, like the rest of Latin America, I think of all the regions in the world, at least from my research, Latin America was probably impacted the most negatively of any place, maybe short of China. We don't really know what went on internally in China. Certainly the lockdowns in Panama were respective of the other nations, where 6, 7, 8, 9 months of hard lockdowns, followed by selective lockdowns over the next year and a half. So that had and I think we're really feeling the implications and repercussions of this today more than we even did a year or two ago. I think people are finally realizing that the incredible damage that was done by locking down these economies, and now you've seen, for example, the workforce has had lots of issues in Panama. The canal functioned very well during the pandemic itself. And again, the canal is not occurring within a vacuum. It happens within the broader nation, the broader region, and of course, the global economy. So I think we'll see for many, maybe even decades to come, the impact and fallout of these lockdowns. From my perspective, the real issue for Panama is it will be a lot of nations will be workforce. The next generation of people to work on the canal, and Panamanians mandate that only Panamanians can work on the canal. That's a national law. When you have kids out of school, as they were in Panama for almost 2 years, a lot of them learning, and I'm going to put it in quotes, online, when kids didn't have broadband access or anything like that. We'll see the repercussions of this over the next generation or two. Again, functionality of the canal during the pandemic was solid. They were very proactive. I'm very positive with the management style in the crisis mode that the ACP exhibited. At the same time, though, I think these longer implications might be lasting for way into the future.
But there wasn't a reduced number of ships going through during the pandemic.
Yeah, it was. As global trade slowed, of course, there was the the natural fallout, but it didn't last long because nations, and I think this is one of the things I pointed out in the book, nations are going to scramble more and more for energy sources. And maybe if you want to talk about this in a minute here, Richard, what is the future of the canal? It's much more on energy, particularly liquid natural gas coming from the United States, going west, or I guess, going south through the canal, all the way out to the Pacific and beyond. That really are the primary revenue streams for the canal going forward, and that didn't really stop much in the lockdowns, because whether it's China or India or South Korea, whomever else is buying that liquid natural gas, they had to keep their homes and run their businesses and do all the things that carbon energy does.
But tell us about this. So tell us about going forward and the energy market and the affectations, of course. I mean, I've been in the canal many times, and of course that new construction, the one side for I don't even remember what they're called, like the Goliath tankers, I suppose, that go through. I realize that some of the infrastructure there as well isn't up to, let's say, the original standard of the original canal.
Well, it's interesting. There was always a desire by the Americans. And again, as I pointed out in the book, the Americans wanted to get rid of the canal. Harry Truman famously said in 1947, why don't we get out of Panama before we're kicked out? So the canal really, for the Americans, World War II kind of ended the real reason it was constructed in the first place, and that was not to have a two ocean navy. As we built bigger battleships and then carriers, the canal really became, I don't want to say moved to a second class status, but it really was an auxiliary, if you will, to the American empire. We stayed with the canal through the rest of the 20th century. There were discussions even in the era after the canal really opened for the first time to a good flow of traffic in 1920, that maybe we should build some bigger locks because ships will get bigger. Those discussions happened over the next 80 years while the Americans were there. The Panamanians themselves, to their credit, when they knew they were going to get the canal in 2000, they had already said before that the formal transfer that they were going to make an effort to build a bigger set of locks to handle what they thought were going to be these massive container ships. Mm-hmm. And so in 2006, there was a national referendum that was overwhelmingly supported by the Panamanian people to fund the expansion of a new set of locks that would at that time be designed for these massive container ships that primarily were handling the traffic from Asia into the United States, primarily the east coast of the U.S. That was really the reason they were constructed, and it had never been done before. Nobody had ever added another set of locks to the Panama Canal. You couldn't Google how to do it. So the Panamanians, to their credit, that I thought over time an excellent job. There were some problems. Of course, if we would have had the same scrutiny, the Americans, that is, when they were building the canal back in the early 20th century, I'm sure there would have been, if there would have been Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, who knows what would have been said. So overall, they did it. And to their credit, it came in around budget. And I thought it was done by Panama. They used external contractors in many ways, but it was a Panamanian project. And it took place in about 9 years, a little bit longer than they thought. What happened, though, in the middle of all of that was two things. First of all, globalization shifted, and the big container vessels never really showed up in the numbers that they thought they were going to. And then something that nobody predicted, and I've heard a lot of people out there running around saying they did. I haven't found anybody who predicted it. Starting in 2006 was the American shale energy revolution. And that happened, again, it was innovation, it was creativity, it was a very American thing. And again, that was not in the planning of the Panamanians, I assure you. Yet, sometimes in life, it's better to be lucky than good. And the Panamanians certainly were lucky, I think. Now, they were prepared, and they saw an opportunity later, and they had that ability to be able to take advantage of moving the bigger LNG, liquid natural gas, NGL ships through the canal. And that really, again, not planned, yet now is the reality for them. That's been a wonderful blessing for the operation of the canal. And again, the shale energy revolution, we just have to go back to the early 2000s when we had presidents of the United States saying, we're dependent on foreign energy. We were building massive import terminals in the United States along the Gulf Coast to bring in natural gas, because late 90s, early 2000s, America was really up against it. I've said before, the reason the 101st was into Crete during the Iraq War wasn't because their biggest export was anything except oil. The world needed that energy, and America, as the world leader, was going to provide it, come hell or high water. Then we wake up one day and the shale energy revolution is happening, and the Panamanian expansion melded with that, and now the Panamanians are the recipients of that effort.
You discuss this in your book, a great read as well.
Thank you.
The post-war era growth, goes into, doesn't go into a decline, but it evolves a bit what it is. And one of the quotes I most enjoyed is right towards the end, is that it's being replaced by a much more uncertain, nationalistic, and dangerous world. Perhaps you'd like to sort of give us a bit more of a background on that.
Well, and I'm not the first one to observe this. I look at it through the lens of international business primarily. That's my role as an academic, and as my earlier books have been on primarily the global economy. When you have, I think be the three pillars of the modern world, which would be carbon energy availability, the security guarantees that the United States provides to the world. It has provided maybe until very recently. And then, of course, the opening of markets and the free flow of capital, giving capitalists more opportunities to what they want with their capital. Those three things, which really have evolved in the last several hundred years, but really gained critical mass post-World War II, and then even accelerated more after the collapse of communism and the integration of China and India to the global economy. That model, which has served humanity, I think, brilliantly, with all the warts and corruptions and human foibles that come in, we just have to look at extreme poverty on this planet and realize that burning of carbon energy, giving capitalists more control over what they want to do with their capital, and a secure world, that's the formula. And that was really a lot of it led by the United States and their allies, like the British and the Panamanians and other parts of Latin America. And I think that the Americans have got a little bit more tired of leading that charge. I mean, I'm coming from the Rust Belt of the United States, which is very similar to Northern England and Eastern France, Northeastern France, where, the industrial giants of those days are long gone, and there's lots of ruination as a result. And I think you're seeing significant portions of, at least in the United States, people just say, why are we leading this? Yes, they benefited immensely in India and China and Africa and Latin America from the system that we pay for, and we've committed to pay for the long term. I think that's waning, and I think lots of nations around the world see that. It scares them, and you're seeing, I think, this more flare of nationalization or regionalization come up, and really in the face of what's uncertainty coming from the United States.
Yeah, and you talk about three sort of main points here. And you've got the trend, so the repositioning of the global supply chains. You talk about the potential, if we know about it, implosion of China. And then, of course, there are global events currently taking place, not least Ukraine, Russia, and obviously Israel, Palestine. How are these likely to affect Panama and the Canal?
Well, I think from a canal perspective, I think that they're blessed. Location. Makes them, I think, as long as they're connected to the United States, and I don't think there's any reason they will never be, especially as the energy revolution, continues apace. I think the canal is going to be it's going to be a beacon of management excellence and hope and expectation that the world can, maybe return back to where it was prior to this new phase we seem to be entering into. From a business perspective of the canal, what really will determine its long-term success will be global trade patterns, and in this case, probably more than anything else, will be energy. With the Ukraine war and with Russia's importance of energy as a source provider for Europe, we're seeing more and more American energy imports go to places like Germany. And even the UK. And so that affects the canal because there's not transit through the canal, because the shale energy revolution is almost exclusively a take the Mississippi River and go east. So you don't need to transit any energy imports to Europe through the canal. That'll impact the canal, and probably not a very positive way. Still, Asia, whether it's China, and I think one of the reasons China is on the verge of an implosion is because of their lack of energy independence, or even energy security, if we want to call it that. So they need imports from all over the world, including the United States, India, South Korea, Japan, the biggest energy importers in the world. That'll keep the canal functioning well. But yet, when there's higher demand for energy and there's greater distances on that supply chain, I think we'll see some events that can arise, as we've just seen with what's going on in the Middle East, that can impact regional and global trading patterns.
It's true. And what I find so very interesting, obviously, is that there's so many conversations. I mean, you are the expert in business. I mean, that's the deal. But when we look at everything else around it, and countries like China previously talking about other canals possible, the canal to connect through Nicaragua. We go Lake Nicaragua and Lake Managua, wouldn't it, to connect with the
Yeah.
the reality of this is very slim, isn't it?
Yeah, that's been discussed almost in parallel with the canal. Yeah, that's a good word forever. There's other things that are apace, though, that I think in terms of supply chain, folks, and international trade, there's a lot happening in Mexico with trying to shorten the move across Mexico, and involving an integrated supply chain with rail, with sea. So I think that the supply chains always evolve. And this evolution is nothing that we should be surprised by, and I think within Latin America, Mexico provides potentially if you want to call it such, a degree of competition for Panama, particularly as it results in smaller product categories. Still, though, I think the canal is in a solid position over time, and the energy luck that they were able to dig up, or whatever the case might be, is going to be a saving grace for them going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we never really expected it, especially under Ortega right now. I mean, a lot of words can be said, but actions are very different, and it's a bit like was it under President Santos here in Colombia when they were talking the Belt and Road Initiative, a railway across Colombia? The geography, it just doesn't lend itself. That's right. Not least the political situation and conflict situation. But Panama has, aside from 1989, been incredibly stable.
Yeah, it has been. And I think, we forget history sometimes. Michael Crichton has one of my best quotes I share with my students. If you don't know history, you're like a leaf that doesn't know it's part of the tree. And to your point, Rick, the building of the Panama Railroad, beginning in 1850, with private capital, by the way. That wasn't a government effort like the canal was. I think that kind of showed capitalists and the governments around the world that, in fact, Panama was geographically friendly enough that it could sustain some kind of a significant operation, whether it was, again, the railroad or eventually the building of the canal by the Americans, finishing what the French started. Everybody else who's tried anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, south of the Rio Grande, has had some significant issues with regards to logistics and geography and all kinds of other issues.
Well, it's nice to have this conversation because it's wholly, I think, a positive conversation. I did read just the other day about, we're reading a lot about Darien, the Darien jungle. And obviously the sliver of land from Panama to Colombia, the only unpaved section of the Pan American Highway. I did read that previously the Americans, there had been an idea floated of bombing it with nuclear bombs in order to make a connection.
There's been all kinds of discussions about Darien as well. My wife's family's from down around that region.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a little town called Chepo, so it's kind of on the route of the migrants. When I was preparing the book, I did spend a little bit of time talking at those refugee camps that are in Panama, folks. I think this kind of goes back to one of the issues that should probably be explored more by researchers or scholars or journalists, is that a lot of those folks that are coming in, of course, there's many coming from around the world coming into Colombia, starting somewhere else, and then making that terrible journey up to Darien. a lot of the folks I spoke with were not who you thought they might be. They're not just poor refugees escaping brutal oppression. A lot of these are middle-class people, formerly middle-class people, some physicians, some lawyers, really small business owners. They got seriously wiped out by the lockdowns. Again, I go back to that point I made before that, Latin America, I think, took it more on the chin than anybody else with regards to closing the economy. And there wasn't the helicoptering of money that came out like it did in Europe or the United States or other parts of the world. Yeah, you pretty much just shut everything down to control the virus, and then reopened one day, and everybody was left on their own. So I think a lot of that working middle class that was rising across Latin America in the last 20 years, they're very desperate. And you're seeing some of those desperate people risk everything to come through that gap that you mentioned there between Colombia and Panama and work their way up to the United States.
I believe that the figure by the end of the year is going to be 500,000 people will have gone through this year, which is just staggering. I was up last year. This time last year, I'll be up next month, up in that area as well. Last year, I managed to speak to Haitians, Cubans, Syrians.
Yeah.
And they say now there's more Ecuadorians coming through as well.
Yeah,
insecurity.
That's right. There's Ecuadorians. I spoke to a lot of Chileans. I spoke to Uruguayans. I spoke to Argentines.
Really?
Yeah, in relatively significant numbers. And you talk to these folks, and these are countries you would never think that these people would leave and travel this way to try to get into the United States. So, which tells me that something was really broke when they locked these countries down, because they all experienced very similar patterns. And again, this is going to be generational, particularly I think in Latin America. So I'm sure anybody listening to this is probably very much aware of that. It's a topic, I think, though, that deserves a lot more exploration in terms of the fallout from this, because it's massive.
Well, aside from this sort of digression onto the Darien, well, of course, it affects Panama immensely because they are the bridge, the land bridge,
Yes,
America and so on. It does sound like the Panama has most things under control, aside from obviously water management. If the rain keeps falling and there's fresh water and climate change does not hammer the isthmus, things look to continue well for the country.
I think you're right. There are elections coming up. They have, and this is one of the beauties of the post Noriega environment. I'm sure most of your listeners know this. The Panamanians were wise enough to say you can't run for re-election as president. You get 5 years and that's it. So we've seen in every election since 1994 that there's been a change in political party, and the political parties are significantly different in Panama. So you have to compete every year or every election cycle, I should say, for about 30 or 40% of the vote, which tends to remain independent, which is more than a lot of more developed democracies, including the United States. So that's a good thing. The government becomes more responsive. There are elections coming up next year. It appears, if you look at the polls right now, that there will not be the return of the PRD, which is the Noriega's party, the party that's currently in power. Looks like there will be another president from another party, possibly an alliance. It might be the return of Ricardo Martinelli, who was president 3 terms ago. But again, that'll speak to the transition away from one political party dominating the scene, is so often the case across many parts of Latin America. So more robust political environment, along with a solid canal, political stability, security. And I would just say the beauty of the Panamanian people. My wife's Panamanian, our children are, of course. Maybe I'm biased, but I just find the Panamanian people, like so many people across Latin America, just to be very wonderful and caring and very family-oriented. And that's a nice foundation on which to build a good society.
I think you're very right there. I have been looking at the polls. It does look like Martinelli at the moment is well positioned to come back. I was there when he was last elected in. But no Panamanian president would be foolish enough to touch the canal.
No, and the Constitution is rigid. They fortified it after the American invasion. That the Panamanian Constitution was reinforced to keep that separation between the government and between the government and the canal authority. And you're right. It's one of those things you just don't touch it. It's like Social Security in the United States. You just don't touch it.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this conversation. Andrew, it has been an absolute pleasure picking your brains and your knowledge about Panama and the Panama Canal and obviously international business. We've been talking here on the LatinNews Podcast to Andrew Thomas, PhD, Professor of International Business at the College of Business at the University of Akron in Ohio. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Transportation Security, the author of 25 books, but the last one being The Canal of Panama and Globalization, Growth and Challenges in the 21st Century. So thank you again for your time and sharing your, boundless knowledge.
Hey, Richard, thanks so much for the opportunity. I do appreciate it so much.
Oh, no, it's been a real pleasure, and hopefully we'll be able to talk to you again in the future, maybe after the elections next year.
I love that. You take good care.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.